welcome. This episode will be presented by one of our guest presenters, and he is one of the most amazing guys I have ever met, and still my favourite tour guide and author, Chris Trotter. Enjoy and welcome to Gavel and the Grave.
Hi there, my name is Chris Trotter. I'm a tour guide here in Edinburgh. I have been doing this for 9 years, and I thought today I would talk about Mary Queen of Scots and show you some of the places in Edinburgh that she was associated with. Mary Queen of Scots is most definitely my favourite character in history. Behind me, you can see Holyrood Palace, and that section there that you're seeing now is actually where Mary Queen of Scots lived. That was kind of the only bit that existed of Holyrood Palace when she was here. We'll go for a little walk and I'll show you her bathhouse, and as I said, I'll tell you a bit about Mary Queen of Scots. Mary Queen of Scots was born on the 8th of December 1542 at Little Linlithgow Palace near Edinburgh. 6 days later she became Queen of Scotland because her father James V died of wounds sustained during battle. And 9 months later she was crowned Queen of Scotland. When I say crowned, what I mean really is more symbolic, because of course the crown was far too big and far too heavy for her little head to cope with. So the Earl of Arran actually had to stand there and hold the crown above her head. Hopefully you can see through there Mary Queen of Scots' bathhouse. This is where she would very occasionally take baths, because people back in those days didn't take baths very often. They didn't take baths because they thought that it would be detrimental to their health. Because if you have the belief was that if you had dirt on your arms and your skin, then that was actually protecting you from any germs. And if you wash them off, then of course you could get germs and then you could die. Because back then physicians were few and far between. Mary Queen of Scots actually did have her own physician. She actually very much respected surgeons. She signed a letter saying that surgeons or physicians should not be forced to take out arms in war, because they were required to keep people healthy and tend to the sick, which is very good. A little side note, she actually had white wine poured into her baths because she thought that white wine would help with her complexion, her very, very pale complexion. Mary Queen of Scots was a very, very striking young woman, especially when she was younger. The common folk, as they were called, I suppose, loved her because she was around about 6 foot tall, with stunning red hair and this white complexion, and they were just like in awe of her. Also, white wine apparently heals ailments like pain, and Mary Queen of Scots did have a lot of pain in her life, especially again towards the end of her life when she was imprisoned for 15 years. Doctors today think she had rheumatoid arthritis. When she was very young, she was taken to Stirling Castle to be brought up by her mother, Mary of Guise. But the English king, King Henry VIII, wanted Mary Queen of Scots to marry his son, even at that age. And he began something called the rough wooing, which was basically to destroy half of Scotland. Now, Mary of Guise came from the French court, and the Scottish government said that they wanted the French to help them evict the English from Scotland. The French said, yeah, that's fine, but what we would like is for you to send Mary Queen of Scots over to us for her safekeeping. So this is what they did. Now, at that time, Mary had been sent to a place called Inchmahome Island, where there was an abbey, and that was for her own safety, because they thought that Stirling Castle was just too easy to attack. So she went with her 4 Marys there, Mary Seton, Mary Beaton, Mary Livingston and Mary Fleming. And they were all the same age, roughly 5 years old, all called Mary, interestingly enough. And they went over to France with her. Now, when she arrived in France, there was a huge amount of celebration for the arrival of these wee girls, and they were just little girls, and they were sent in state down rivers and along, and so lots of people could see them, and there were lots of people playing music. Mary Queen of Scots stayed at the French court with Henry II, who would be her father-in-law, and all the four Marys were sent to a convent to be taught by nuns. Mary Queen of Scots went on to marry little Francis, the Dauphin, but unfortunately, at a very young age, he died of an ear infection, of all things. And Mary Queen of Scots was completely devastated. This was the love of her life. She thought that she would be Queen of France and everything would be nice and happy. Unfortunately, before that as well, Henry II had died of an illness. So she was left almost without the two men that she really liked. She got on very well with Henry II. It was said that at age, I think it was 11, that she knew how to entertain the king perfectly. Her mother then died as well, and she realised that she had to return home to become Queen of Scotland. She didn't really want to do this because she hadn't been to Scotland for many, many years, as I said, since she was a child, so she was apprehensive at the very least. Behind me is the John Knox house. John Knox was a Protestant reformer and he hated Catholics. So when Mary Queen of Scots came to Scotland, he really didn't like her at all. He preached against her in the pulpits, and there was an awful lot of fiery back and forth between him and Mary Queen of Scots. He actually reduced her to tears on at least one occasion. And this is where he preached, here at St Giles Cathedral. When Mary Queen of Scots first arrived in Scotland, the whole country was swathed in mist, certainly Edinburgh was, and John Knox actually said that this was an omen, that Mary had brought with her an awful lot of sadness and dolour, and that this was not going to be a good reign at all. When John Knox finally died, he was buried here at his own cathedral. This is the marking spot of the grave. It's actually underneath car parking space number 23. Despite the mist, Mary Queen of Scots was actually very happy to arrive in Scotland. After a long time, 15 years, finally she was back in her home country. When she arrived at the docks, there were a huge crowd gathered to say hello and to welcome her to her new kingdom. When she first arrived, she was taken to the house of the prominent merchant Andrew Lamb, and there a message was sent to the town that Mary had arrived, because she had arrived several hours earlier than expected. Eventually, a whole group of nobles arrived to take her up to Holyrood Palace. Mary's first night at Holyrood Palace was not the best one. She didn't get much sleep because hundreds of amateur musicians had gathered outside to play music for Her Majesty. Being the nice person that she was, she actually told them that they could continue doing this for the next few nights. Yeah, not her best decision. Now, because of the excitement and the celebration, huge bonfires were lit on that first night for Mary Queen of Scots. They'll be seen all the way up the Royal Mile, and I can imagine her standing there at the window of her palace and looking up the Royal Mile and seeing all those bonfires lit for her. It would have been quite a magnificent sight. Just before Mary arrived in Scotland, the country had gone through a change of religion. They went from being Catholic to Protestant after a big reformation started by John Knox himself. So John Knox said, that's fine, you can come to Scotland, but you will allow the people to maintain their religion. Mary Queen of Scots said, that's fine, but she also said that she expected people to allow her to worship in her own way. Her first Mass in Edinburgh didn't go so well because people were very angry about that, and they actually tried to storm the chapel at Holyrood Palace. A man called Lord Robert actually barred the way to the chapel, and if it hadn't been for him doing that, I think blood would have been spilled. The poor priest was so scared that he couldn't even lift the host at the elevation. A great procession took place to officially welcome Mary into Edinburgh and Scotland. She went from the castle in state all the way down to Holyrood Palace, and there were lots of things going on. There was a girl that came out of a big globe at the Lawn Market, and at the Market Cross, wine was poured out of the spouts by beautiful maidens in probably very little clothing. Now, to begin with, Mary had a lot of fun in Scotland. She could hunt, she could ride, lots of banquets and great state occasions. But the problem was there were things called the Lords of Scotland. They were pretty much in control of Scotland before Mary came along. When I say in control, they were kind of fighting for control, really. And they did not appreciate Mary coming in because they wanted status. And they basically fought between themselves for that status. Mary was asked to find a husband by her advisors. This wasn't a simple going down to the pub and finding a mate. This was extremely complicated because there were several factors that needed to be right, especially that of religion. If Mary married a Protestant, that would please her Protestant public, but it would upset her Guise relations in France, whom she still heavily relied upon. There was also the problem of Elizabeth and what she felt was right for her cousin. She actually tried to put forward some suggestions for Mary to think about. One of them was Robert Dudley. Dudley was a favourite of Queen Elizabeth, but that was odd because his father was a traitor. But Mary was very interested in a guy called Don Carlos, who was heir to the throne of Spain. That's because, of course, he was Spanish, and he was heir to the throne. When John Knox found out about that, he was absolutely livid. Because, of course, she was going towards the Catholic religion again. He railed against her in the pulpits because of that, and she was furious also with John Knox. She invited him, she demanded that he come to Holyrood Palace and explain himself. John Knox said that it was his right to preach against her, especially when it came to religion. Mary said that she couldn't understand why he was doing this because she had said that she would maintain the Protestant religion in Scotland. She said that her marriage was none of his business, and he said to her, "If your marriage brings Catholicism to this country, then it is all of my business." Eventually she settled upon her cousin, Lord Henry Darnley. Now, to begin with, she wasn't that set on him. Yeah, she liked him, and he was good. He could play the lute very well. He could hunt, and he could ride, and he could do all the things that interested her. But she was actually torn between him and Lord Robert Dudley, who had just been made Earl of Leicester. But then the Dudley match fell through, and Mary was actually very upset because she really actually quite liked Dudley. However, then her cousin fell ill, and she suddenly was terrified of the notion of losing him. She nursed him back to health at Stirling Castle, but it took a long time for him actually to recover. During that time, however, while she was tending to him in his sickbed, she fell madly in love with him. When Mary finally married Darnley, she actually wore her mourning dress out of respect for her latest husband, Francis. Looking back on it, the mourning dress could have actually represented the mourning of her personal happiness, because that was about to be ripped away from her. Darnley was not a nice man. He was very jealous, very hot-headed, and he wanted status. He wanted to be king. But Mary really was not going to allow him to be king if he behaved like that. He was drunk, he was abusive, he actually was very suspicious of Rizzio, who was Mary, Queen of Scots' personal secretary. This unfortunately led to one of the most brutal murders in Scottish history. In front of a pregnant Mary and in the presence of Darnley, the lords burst into her dining chamber and dragged Rizzio out into the next room. They then stabbed him 57 times. 57. They then threw his body down the main stair, stripped it of all its clothes and fine jewellery, and left him lying there in that defiled state. Mary's chambers might as well have been an abattoir. Now, during the attack, one of the lords held a pistol to Mary's swollen belly. This was regarded as a threat to her child. Her son James was finally born here at Edinburgh Castle. This wing is where the birthing chamber was. Labour was long, difficult and painful. There was massive celebration. The entire castle artillery was set off, which must have caused a massive amount of sound. Bonfires were lit, 500 bonfires lit all around the city and the surrounding areas. I can imagine Mary standing at her birthing chamber window, looking out towards the Pentland Hills with her son in her arms and saying, "These fires are lit for you." However, the birth of a male heir meant that Darnley was put further down the pecking order. When Mary showed the baby to Darnley, she said, "This is your son and no other man's." But she then also said that he is so much your son that I fear for his future. This was a slight against Darnley. When James was christened at Stirling Castle, Darnley didn't even show up for the ceremony. I'm standing on West College Street, and it was around about this area that Darnley finally met his end. One of my colleagues actually said to me, it wasn't a matter of who wanted to kill Darnley, it was a matter of who didn't want to kill him. I'm standing here at the old East Port. Now, this was the edge of Edinburgh, and this is near, where Kirk-a-Field, the house in which Darnley was staying when he died. Darnley was actually recuperating from, I think it was measles, at Kirk-a-Field. And on the night of his death, Mary and the lords actually visited him in his room. He couldn't leave his bed, so they came into his chamber. And they played dice, and they had a great time. There was music, and Mary actually got on very well with Darnley. She was speaking to him very amicably. But around 11 o'clock, she was reminded that she had to be somewhere, and she took off. Which was interesting because she was actually planning on spending the night there. If that had been the case, history might be a little different. Late in the night, an explosion woke Mary from her sleep. She sent messengers to find out what it was. When she finally got the news that it was Kirk-a-Field that exploded, she was deeply shocked. Later, the body of Darnley was found strangled in the garden of Kirk-a-Fields. Now, a lot of people were suspected of being involved in the killing of Darnley, and names started to be found out. One of these names was a man called Bothwell. Bothwell was on Mary's Privy Council, and it was, I think, well known that he actually very much liked her. Eventually, she was abducted by him and raped. And during that period of incarceration almost, she decided that she actually quite liked him, or she forced herself to think that. But unfortunately, Bothwell was suspected, as I said, of being involved in Darnley's murder. And this didn't look good for Mary Queen of Scots at all, because people then began to think that she was involved as well. This, unfortunately, was the beginning of the end for Mary's reign. It lasted only 6 years, from 1561 to 1567. 1561 to 1567. She was eventually captured at the Battle of Carberry Hill, which was not exactly a battle, more like a series of negotiations where not a single shot was fired. But she was taken captive, and she spent her last night in Edinburgh at the house of the Lord Provost, Sir Simon Preston of Craigmillar Castle. He was one of her few surviving allies. After that, she was taken to Lochleven Castle. She spent a year imprisoned at Lochleven Castle, where she was allowed to have one of her maids, Mary Seaton. But when she first arrived, her rooms had not been prepared very well at all. They were dank and horrible, and Mary, Queen of Scots, had a complete nervous breakdown. She eventually escaped from Lochleven Castle, gathered an army and met the lords at the Battle of Langside. And unfortunately, she lost. She fled down into England and was captured by her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. She spent 19 years imprisoned in England, moving around from different castle to different castle. Eventually, she was found guilty of treason. Finally, a bit of comfort. That was one long walk. Talking of comfort, when Mary Queen of Scots was in prison in England, she actually did have a lot of comfort. Yeah, things were a little bit different because she was imprisoned, technically. But because she was a queen, she was allowed to have her own clothes. In fact, a whole load of shipment of clothes and things were shipped from Lochleven Castle down to England, Carlisle Castle. This was her first port of call in England. And she stayed there for 2 months. She was looked after by a man called Francis Knollys, who was one of Queen Elizabeth's courtiers, and he actually was very much charmed by her. And he did give her a lot of freedom. Although at one point she went riding to catch hares and things like that, and he did put his foot down then because he was terrified of Mary escaping, which is kind of his job to stop her escaping. Her next jailer was the Earl of Shrewsbury. He had several castles and houses around England, and she was quite often moved from place to place. She stayed at one of his houses, which was run basically by Shrewsbury's wife, the Bess of Hardwick. Bess of Hardwick was a very dominant woman. But she and Mary did go on quite well. They sat and did lots of tapestries together, and some of which still survive to this day. Now, even though Mary was a prisoner, she was given a lot of privileges and nice little things. But this did put a huge strain on Queen Elizabeth's purse, because she paid at least £56 a week, which back then was a lot of money. The problem was, while Mary was still in England, she was always going to be a threat to the throne. There were actually a few plots to try and do this. Eventually, evidence was found that Mary had deliberately actually tried to get involved in one of these plots. Beforehand, it was dubious whether she had or not. That, unfortunately, as I said, sealed her downfall completely. She was executed at Fotheringay Castle the following year. Mary's execution was a completely botched job. It said that the executioner was either drunk or both inexperienced. One of the eyewitnesses actually said that the axe looked like something that you would chop a log with, much like this one here. The first blow landed not on Mary's neck, but actually on her head. She looked up at the executioner and said, "Sweet Jesus." It took at least 3 blows to kill Mary Queen of Scots. Hopefully, by the second blow, Mary was either unconscious or dead. When the executioner had finally finished the job, he lifted up her head and said, "God save the Queen." Unfortunately, he was holding a wig, not actually her hair, because her hair had completely disintegrated over the years of stress in imprisonment. So the head fell back down onto the platform and rolled away. Not only that, but after she was lying there dead on the platform, a sudden ruffling began under her skirts, and people thought she would actually come back to life. But a dog suddenly crawled out from underneath those skirts. It turned out to be Mary's favourite pet. Mary Queen of Scots' body lay for several days in Fotheringay Castle. It was eventually removed from the castle under cover of darkness in a candlelit procession. Mary Queen of Scots wrote a lot of poems during her lifetime. I'm going to read you now the last poem that she wrote on the morning of her execution. O my Lord and my God, I have trusted in thee. O my dear Jesus, now liberate me. In shackle and chain, in torture and pain, I long for thee. In weakness and sighing, in kneeling and crying, I adore and implore thee.
to liberate me.